Welcome to Higher Edification, a podcast featuring college presidents and other education leaders talking about the state of higher education as well as the challenges and opportunities we face. Higher Edification is a production of AICUP, the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities of Pennsylvania, and Misericordia University. I'm your host, Dan Myers, president of Misericordia University in Dallas, Pennsylvania, also known as President Dan on TikTok. I'm joined today by Tom Foley, president of AICUP. Welcome, Tom. It's great to have you on the podcast. This will only be our second episode. And so you being the head of AICUP, of course, we thought it'd be great to have you on, and you have a broad view of all of the issues and things that are facing higher education. So there's a lot we could talk about today.
Well, that's certainly true, Dan, but thanks for the title. I love higher education.
Yeah.
And I'll try to live up to that title in our conversation today.
Oh, very good, very good. Yeah, we took quite a bit of time coming up with that. I think we reviewed and rejected 50 or more titles before we finally
Well,
landed
this
on it.
is higher education, so that's expected.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. We should have had a committee working on it. Well, Tom, one thing I think is interesting when I'm with presidents is that we've all had different kind of routes into becoming president, and I know you and I had quite different paths getting there. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how you got to be a college president. You were president of Mount Aloysius for how long were you president there?
8 years.
8 years.
Yeah.
But you didn't come through the faculty typical route that I did. And so I'm curious, how did you get to that?
No, different route, kind of altogether, Dan. I'm a lawyer, as you know. I actually worked in Washington and in Harrisburg. I worked on several of the committees. Believe it or not, I worked for now President Biden in my Washington years. In Harrisburg, I was a cabinet member for Governor Casey. So I was Secretary of Labor and Industry. I held 2 different cabinet positions for him. I had a run at some elective offices, Dan, which fortunately for me did not work out. And then I made one of several career track changes, and I decided I wanted to try to use my skills on behalf of nonprofit organizations. I had done a lot of volunteer work. I spent a couple of years in Belfast, I worked the Troubles, lots of things like that. So I ended up, Dan, as president of the 2 largest volunteer-based nonprofits in this state. I was president of the United Way of Pennsylvania, and then I was president of the Red Cross of southeastern Pennsylvania, which is the 2nd largest in the whole country. After I had done those jobs for about 15 years, I knew I have 1 or 2 more jumps in me, in the career, and thought about, how else can I use these skills? And I'm from a very large family, which there's 12 of us, grandparents from Ireland. None of our 4 grandparents had a high school education. 11 of the 12 of us have a college degree. And that was very important to our parents who were high school grads. And my father's line always was, nobody can ever take your education away from you. And I thought, what had made the biggest difference in my own family, growing up? And besides, fabulous parents and community and all, it was higher education. Mm-hmm. So I made a deliberate decision that, I want to use at least some part of the rest of my career trying to give back in an area that had made such a difference. We're not going to do it here, but if I told you the stories of my siblings, and so much of it enabled by higher education, and with only one exception, all of them in independent nonprofit schools who found a way to help them, get there. So that's how I ended up. I have to say, I have a brother who was the longest serving agent in the history of a very important federal agency. And I kidded him and I said, Kevin, you were never vetted the way I was vetted to be a college president. I couldn't believe all the checks. It was great. All the levels of interviews. The first interview was 4.5 hours. But again, as you said, Dan, I was coming from a non-traditional perspective. Fortunately for me, I had continued to write professionally. So I had about 150 publications, which are, a lot of the work that college professors do. I had lectured at the time I first put my name in there for a presidency. I had already delivered lectures at 30 plus different institutions, most of them in Pennsylvania. So I had, that in the background. But that's what made me make that call, Dan, that, this has made such a difference for my Phi family, second generation American family, and So I jumped into the field.
Yeah, so I wonder how the faculty received you. That you kind of pointed that out based on some of your experiences, but sometimes if you're not one of us, so to speak, there can be suspicion that about your motives or your experience, just kind of knowing what college and faculty life is like. Did you have to work your way through that when you started?
Well, absolutely. And Dan, you know what that's like when you do those interviews. So when I first went to the campus of Mount Aloysius, of course, I did tons of interviews with individual faculty members and committees and board members. But the first big interview, I had about 125 people in the room, and they could ask you whatever they wanted to ask you. And people kept calling me doctor. And after that interview was over, there's one other funny aspect of it that I will tell you. But a professor comes up to me, and I knew this professor only as Dr. D, and she had been on the search committee. And she said, Tom, I saw you kind of not that comfortable when people called you doctor. And I said, I am a lawyer, I have a JD, but I have 7 brothers, and if they find out I've suddenly decided I'm a doctor, I'm in for a lot of heat. And she started laughing, and she said to me, Tom, higher education is all about terminal degrees, that you have the ultimate degree in whatever your field is. She said, you have one. It's from Yale, so shut up. That was her comment. Though I still never, Dan, I was never comfortable with, I had some students that called me doctor, but I wasn't comfortable with that. But obviously, I'd written a thesis at Yale, which was published in its law journal, somewhat equivalent to a PhD. But, did have that side where, and I found out later that particular professor was a lawyer. And I only knew her as Dr. D, but she'd come into it from there. The other funny thing, which is very relevant given where we're sitting right now at Misericordia, was I had a sister in the back of the room say to me, well, what do you know about nuns? So this was another, not only have you not worked in higher ed, but you haven't worked at a Catholic institution. And I could tell that this was a sister. And I said, oh, sister, I think you're going to be sorry that you asked that question. I said, here's what I know about nuns. And, of course, I went to a Catholic grade school and I went to a Catholic high school. Yeah. And I said, when I was in grade school, I was the assistant to the janitor, when I was in 8th grade, $10 a week. And so one of the things that I had to do was, paint and fix things in the convent, for the nuns. But also on occasion, I carried in cases of beer to the convent. So one thing I know about nuns is they like beer, So anyway, that eased things a little bit, Dan. But I got both of those kind of questions. You're very non-traditional. And what do you know about Catholic higher ed? I also got, interestingly, Dan, I had people who were like, why do you want to be here? Why do you want to be here? You have a Yale Law degree, you went to Dartmouth College, you have all this fancy stuff. Why do you want to be here? And thankfully for me, another Sister of Mercy stood up and said, look at the man's record. He's been about services. She kind of quieted that. But, it's fair enough,
those are interesting divides because really the role of a college president is so varied in so many different ways, and there's so many different groups and constituencies you have to work with, and trying to get that just the title thing, the doctor or president, people talk to you. What do you do to be accessible enough to people, especially in these small college environments? You're not off somewhere doing your work. You're part of the campus, and yet at the same time, it's important for people to recognize, that we have credentials and that we have experience that's important in doing our work. And I found it tricky myself. When I was a professor, I didn't really feel comfortable with the formality of people calling me Dr. Myers or Professor Myers all the time. But on the other hand, you need to maintain a certain amount of authority and things in a classroom. And so I found it tricky. People started calling me Prof. D, which I kind of liked. And here I gravitated into this thing of, and I said it about my TikTok persona, I guess, which I go by President Dan on there. So I get the president thing. They know who I am. They know what my position is. But I use my first name so that it's a little bit more, I don't feel so distant. But that's important in a different way, because one of the challenges that we have You wrote about this recently, is this perception of elitism in higher education. And what do we do that causes that to happen, that problem to be out there? And what do we do about it? I wonder if you have some thoughts on that from your own experience and just, observing all of this, what's going on and talking to other presidents in your job.
Yeah, well, let me speak to the word elitism, Dan, for just a minute. Absolutely, there are institutions in the country, I was lucky to go to two of them, that cater to wealthier populations. I got to go to them because I came from a big family. My father really worked in a factory, and I got full scholarships. But most of these institutions that I work with, most of these 90 schools, have constituencies that are very like what you have at Misericordia and very like what I had at Mount Aloysius. We had 60% first-generation kids. We had 50% Pell kids. Mm-hmm. The biggest issue for us was we got to graduate these kids on time, and we got to make sure their debt load isn't high, And that is the work of most of the presidents of our institutions. Mm-hmm. They're not sitting on some pile of endowment money or anything like that. It surprises people, Dan, to find out that these independent nonprofit schools actually have the highest percentage of low-income kids, not our publicly funded schools. No offense to them, they're doing a great job. But we actually have 45% of all the kids who are eligible for federal aid to go to college. They're in our schools. That's more than the state system. That's more than the state-related. That's more than the community colleges. It's part of the mission, as it is at Misericordia, of many, many of these schools. The other thing about the elitism charges, I always tell people, just come to the campus, and you won't see, fancy, some of the stuff you read about nationally. You're not going to see most of them don't have pools, let alone fancy pools. They don't have any of that stuff. They don't have, as we didn't at Mount Aloysius, and I know that you don't at Misericordia, there's no big middle level management because you're balancing your budget every year, and there's no government writing you a check at the end of the year saying, here you go. Right. You have to figure that out. I think, and I've said this before, that most of the independent nonprofits are very like small businesses because you limp, in our case, to the finish line on June 30th and just make sure that the operating revenue, matches all those liabilities. Yeah. And you wrestle with that every single year. And that's the story of most of these schools. Not to say we don't have some phenomenal world-class institutions who have phenomenal amounts of financial resources, and that's great. And that has enabled them to do world-class research. Some of the best research that helped us in COVID came right from Pennsylvania institutions. But that's not the story for most of them. And I think that's a very unfair criticism.
Well, it's like a lot of things where the certain the top groups get in the public eye, and then that becomes the reality in people's minds. When we think about college football, we think about Ohio State and Michigan, and that's not what college football is actually like in 99% of the institutions. When we think about higher education, we tend to think about the Harvards and the Penns and the schools that are out there in the public eye for various reasons. But the reality is that most of us, we're doing something very, very different from them, and in what we do day to day, but also in the finances of
absolutely, absolutely. And as I say, we're very proud of the work of these world-class institutions, and many of them are in our nonprofit sector. Some of them are in our public sector, doing just phenomenal work. I'm very grateful to have gotten some of the tools that I got because they gave me that opportunity, and to be able to use them, on behalf of schools like ours, the one that you work at and the ones that I work with. I want to go back to something, Dan, you said earlier about how, as a president, doctor, professor, whatever they call you, how do you maintain or even build connections to your students? I had an unfair advantage. I was a twofer at Mount Aloysius. Michelle was not an employee of the institution. But when I took the job, I said, I need just a small office for Michelle. And my predecessor was like, really? And I said, you'll see why. And absolute twofer. Michelle was such a visible presence. Everybody knew her. And she had this little office next to the men's room. She'd have cups of tea in there. She just had a way of picking out kids that maybe needed a cup of tea, just in the Catherine Macaulay tradition,
Right.
kind of thing. But like yourself, I was also that kind of president that I enjoyed tremendously the various activities the students were in. Not just sports. I mean, I went to lots of sporting events. But I mean, the plays were just phenomenal. And the amount of kids that could be involved in something like that. We had a small but vibrant little arts community there. And, being a visible part of those things, and what a gift, what a gift to us, to Michelle and I, that we could be part of that we could bring the community in, to the campus and be with those students. It's just, an unexpected joy of being a college president is you really can become very close to lots of students.
Yeah. Well, that's one of the things I think that we have a special claim to at these smaller kinds of schools is that, there really are personal relationships, and it's not just the president who, has a minor role in that really compared to everyone else, but the faculty and the staff here. At Misericordia, I have just been, sort of unendingly impressed with how invested they are, putting their lives into what's going on here, and really knowing students. And almost every time I talk to a student, they'll tell me a story about some phenomenal thing that you would never guess that a faculty member would do for a student, all the way to getting a call in the middle of the night and I'm at a party and I feel uncomfortable. I don't know what to do. I'll come and get you.
Sure.
That kind of thing. It's just wonderful to be in a place where people get attached in that way. That's one of the reasons why we do such a good job of getting these students to graduation. We beat almost everybody here in terms of sort of the characteristics of our student body and how well they do at getting through graduation. Well, it's because of that thick connection that they have.
Yeah. No, I want to be very explicit about that, Dan. All that stuff gets measured, as you know. There are these 5 different national entities that measure graduation rates and student debt levels, et cetera. And these schools, every time you measure and then compare them to the other sectors, they're the world beaters. It's amazing to me that the average student debt for kids coming out of these independent nonprofit schools over 10 years, compiled by TICUS, everybody accepts them as the authorities, is lower than the average student debt of kids who went to publicly funded schools, which schools are receiving, billions of dollars in state aid that these schools are not. And I think it is very much because of that. You will laugh, Dan. These are small institutions. We had 200 plus employees in the whole school. I met with every new employee. And the last thing I would say to them is, I just want you to know that the most important line in your job description is the last one, which says, and such other duties as may be from time to time prescribed. And I would say to them, I said, everybody here has, at least 3 jobs. And one of the jobs might be, notice, which happened often, where I was in Pennsylvania, it was a very poor area, where a faculty member would call somebody on the staff and say, I've got a kid, I don't think this kid's eating. It would be stuff like that. Or we started a mock trial team, and the coach of the mock trial team was a big local lawyer, and he came to me and said, Tom, most of my kids don't have appropriate clothes. So we did a thing, and we figured out, and we got some donors to put in money so we could, things like that. But that's what I meant by everybody has, at least 3 jobs. If we have an admissions program on a Saturday, even though you're a professor and you teach in the classroom, we need you to be there, so that you can talk to the families and let them know sociology can really help fill out your child's education, those kinds of things. And that's what I meant about that's one of your jobs.
Yeah.
It doesn't really just stop with what happened in that classroom. And I think, as you said, that's the magic. That's why these schools have such an extraordinary record of getting their kids to the finish line on time with less debt, because everybody's involved in that, and there is such a sense of community, especially many of these schools are pretty small. We're talking 1,500 or less students.
Right.
So it is a real community where you can touch, at the next office, everybody's involved in the enterprise.
Yeah, it's really something here. I grew up in the big state schools. I was a Ohio State undergraduate, and I had a good time there. I feel I got a very good education there. I'm not knocking it in any way. It's different though, and I went to Wisconsin Madison for my PhD, so another big school. And then even before I came here, the schools I was in, 10 or 15,000 students, not gigantic, but bigger than this. And there's a real difference here. It's not just about the size, it's about a commitment that we have to the mission. We know what we're about, and we ask people when we're hiring folks, we're saying, hey, this is what we're about. We have these Mercy ideals. This is what we're trying to do with students. Tell us how you're committed to doing that kind of work. And one of my friends said, when you come to a school like this, you're not just taking a job, you're choosing a lifestyle and a life that's embedding yourself in the lives of others in a different way.
Yeah. Oh, it's about way more than what happens, in the classroom, for the vast majority of these schools. Let me turn the tables on you for a second, Dan, because you've had an interesting trajectory.
Yeah.
Tell me about some of the professors or relationships that moved you to get to the point where you are, both choosing sociology, choosing a PhD. Any extraordinary people that come to mind?
Well, there's, anybody who thinks, I always think when people say they're a self-made person, I always laugh to myself and thinking, no, you're not, because there's so many people that contribute in different ways to your life. And, sometimes it's a small thing that they do, but it's really big in your life. And, one example of that is when I was in my first year of college, my parents moved out of state, out of Ohio, and I wasn't going to be considered a in-state student anymore unless I could somehow maintain an address. And so my neighbors in my town that I was from let me use their address all the way through college. And I would have had to drop out. I couldn't have paid the out-of-state tuition. And it's a small thing. They just, for 4 years they forwarded mail to me, but they changed my life. There's so many things like that that happen along the way. But in terms of becoming eventually a college president, a lot of it was a series of accidents, where, I think a lot of faculty members who end up doing administrative work, they just get drafted into it, right? And so when I was a faculty member, I just gotten tenure, and the dean asked me, he said, we need someone to chair your department. How about it? And then you're off. You start doing this administrative work, and you still teach when you're a department chair, but less, and you do less research. You don't have time because you're doing the department chair stuff. But I would say that guy was really important in my life because his name was Mark Roche, and he's still a faculty member at Notre Dame. He was dean for a long time and did a tremendous job. But he helped me see the value of doing that kind of work, and that you're enabling the other people to do their research and to do their teaching in the best possible way. If you're taking care of the kind of stuff in the background, the structure, the systems, the infrastructure, and I always thought about that when I was invited to take another step. How about being an associate dean, or how about being a provost or something? I always be thinking like, what am I doing here in terms of contributing to this overall enterprise? And I'm going to make more of a contribution this way or this way. And he taught me how to see the value in this work that, faculty will joke and call it, you're going over to the dark side when you become an administrator. But there's real value in doing it, and doing it well, and doing it in a way that helps them be in an environment where they can do their work in the best possible way. And when you have people who aren't doing that for the right reasons and aren't thinking about it in that way, they're on a power trip or something. I don't know how you think you're going to have that much power as an associate dean or something, but if they're doing it for those reasons, they want to order people around or something, that's not going to be. They're not going to be successful doing that because that's the wrong reason to do it.
Sure. So. Well, I'm sure he saw those qualities in you, Dan, and I bet he was very impressed that you still had a garage band when you were a professor. But it's partly things like that, but probably realized that you had the personality.
Yeah. Well, that's a funny thing. I don't want to talk too much about the band other than to say it's one of those things that I use to help people realize I'm a real person, right? Mm-hmm. And that I'm not just some administrator sitting in an office up there somewhere, but
You're President Dan.
I
You're
can,
President Dan.
I can get down there and sing a rock song with play guitar with my friends, and so you have to attend to certain things like that too, because you want to be real, and they need to know about your life and your history, and like Tom, you're an athlete, and I'm sure that's something that came up in your conversations with students and help you connect to their experience, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I had in the same vein, I had a phenomenal teacher in high school. I had some really fabulous teachers growing up. I mean, I don't know how I got so lucky, but some just terrific teachers. But I had one teacher who I never heard of Dartmouth College. And he said, I think you can go to school like I said, I don't have money for a school like that. I'm doing that $10 a week job, saving the dough. Yeah. And he said, no. He says, if you get in, you'll get the scholarship because it's based on need. And he changed the trajectory of tons of young men and women who went to that high school. That we were first and second generation Americans, very ethnic. Parents hadn't had that opportunity, and we wouldn't have known about it except for that guy. Pointing us, and I'm still in touch with a lot of those friends.
Yeah, that is very powerful. I mean, it's a life-changing intervention he made in your life, and it takes us to another one of our sort of bugaboo topics that we have to deal with these days, and that it's connected to the elitism thing, but it's about the cost of higher education. And you had this impression, I could never go to Dartmouth. It cost, and back then, I don't know what it was, but, it was way too much for your family to manage with 12 kids. And, so, but he helped you see something different.
We would never have known, Dan. My family would never have known that was possible, except for that man.
And that's what we're facing right now, because there's a lot in the press about the rising cost of higher education, and they're talking about the tuition, the sticker price, right? But scholarshiping has been going up too.
Sure.
And so, the reality of what people are going to have to pay is very, very different than what that sticker price is.
Well, I mean, higher education is like a lot of other things in life. Nobody pays the sticker price. There was a great article by somebody, I don't always agree with George Will, but he had a great piece in the Washington Post about the reason that both public and private institutions have these high sticker prices is because, and George had all of this data to demonstrate this, we Americans still think that if something costs more, it's better, and he had all this data in there. And back before either of us was involved in this enterprise in the 50s and 60s, that started to happen. The real key number is the net tuition and fees. What are you paying, at the end of the day for your education? And the last 10 years, all this stuff gets counted. U.S. Department of Education, they have this whole thing called iPads, and they count all of this. From 2012 to 2022, the actual average net tuition at independent nonprofit colleges went down. It was just over $13,000. It's just under $13,000 now. That's net tuition and fees. That's less than the average net tuition and fees at our state-related institutions in Pennsylvania, and that's without getting federal money. There was an old thing, Dan, you may remember, called the Bennett hypothesis, and when Secretary Bennett of Education many years ago came up with this and said, if you give more money to education at any level, they raise their prices. That was the Bennett hypothesis. And I said, they just need to look at the data today, because these schools, these Pennsylvania schools, have proved the opposite of the Bennett hypothesis. Yeah. There is more Pell money, there is more FIA money than there was 10 years ago, but the actual net tuition is less because many schools did what those schools did for me. And when they recognize that somebody's not going to be able to afford that, it's not like they're writing them a check because they don't have the money either. They're forgiving that cost.
Right.
It's such a hard thing, Dan, for people in our position to explain the difference between sticker price on an automobile, and what somebody actually pays when they go off the lot. But the same thing happens in higher education, though I think the gaps are bigger, what the sticker price is versus what people actually pay.
Well,
but that's the reason for it.
I want to go back to that, Tom, because I want to emphasize, because I think it's that decrease. That's not even inflation adjusted.
That's
dollars,
not inflation
right?
adjusted.
So if we account for inflation, the price is going
Way
down,
lower.
way
significantly
lower
for Pennsylvania. Well, I always say this, Dan, and how unique Pennsylvania is on the higher education sphere. We have world-class publicly funded institutions. We have world-class independent nonprofit institutions. But we have 90 of those independent nonprofit institutions. That's among the most in the country. We are the second best state in the country at importing students to these excellent schools, and that gets lost, who contribute to our economy, as a result. But we have such a unique advantage to have all of these institutions in all of these communities, 60 communities across the state, like Dallas, Pennsylvania. Think about Dallas. I read a book about nonprofits once where the person took some piece of a street in New York and said, what would that street look like without the nonprofits who are housed in these buildings? Think about what Dallas would look like without Misericordia. Mm-hmm. Think about what Crescent, Pennsylvania would look like without Mount Aloysius. And try doing that 60 times. Think about what Wilkes-Barre down the road would look like without the two independent nonprofit schools that are there, King's and Wilkes. Mm-hmm. Major contributors embedded in these communities. And when I say contributors, they do these analyses of what's the value of higher education in the economy. I used to be Secretary of Labor and Industry. We had a list of the top industries in Pennsylvania. Higher education is the fourth largest industry in Pennsylvania. We're larger than tourism, and many other big, energy areas. We support 1 in every 30 jobs in this economy in this state. These schools are responsible for 1 in every $32. That's an independent economic analysis. Every year, these schools bring $24 billion in value to Pennsylvania's GNP. That's about half the value of our entire state budget. Mm-hmm. And if you add our hospital systems, because we have a number of them associated with our schools, when Penn State runs that number, they include their hospital systems. We don't. You can double that number. It's $48 billion. That's not to mention the kids that you have here at Misericordia. Their families come and visit them. They're spending money in Dallas, Pennsylvania. Mm-hmm. You can put a number on that. The volunteer work your kids do. You guys are a national model, mm-hmm. And you can put a dollar value on that. All of that value, and you start off as you're the fourth largest industry anyway. But when you think about it in the micro level, how you're embedded in these communities, people get to come to plays here. People get to follow your sports teams, which are generally pretty competitive. I follow that kind of stuff. They're generally pretty competitive. I mean, there's a whole other life there that these institutions bring. So I always say to people, yes, they are educational beachfronts, but they are also economic juggernauts. Yeah. They are philanthropic partners. They are community investors. Think about, as I thought about that book with the street in New York, what this Commonwealth would look like without these 90 institutions embedded. Wait till you hear this. The average age of these schools is 138 years. So they've been embedded in those communities all that time. And I don't think that's appreciated enough. I don't think people think of it that way. This is practically unique. There's only 3 or 4 other states in the country that have anywhere near the number of institutions that we have that are educational operators, economic generators, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So, really valuable.
Yeah, it's a powerful piece of the social, political, economic reality of Pennsylvania. And, we're always very happy to be a part of that in every possible way, too. We're always reaching out, looking for ways to partner with companies and with our local and state elected officials. We want to be a really positive part of what's going on.
But you know what I think, Dan? I think it goes back to where we started this conversation. Academics, and I'm non-traditional, and you're non-traditional in many ways as well. And we think of ourselves in educational terms alone. We don't think about ourselves as economic generators. We don't think of ourselves as community and philanthropic partners. We don't think of ourselves as workforce suppliers. Mm-hmm. 44,000 new workers every single year in Pennsylvania graduate from these schools mm-hmm. and stay and work here. Yeah. A lot of them people who came to this state from somewhere else because of these excellent institutions. We don't think of ourselves, and I think when I think about why don't people talk about that more, I think it's because we're mostly people with an academic inclination. We're very focused on our field, and we don't think about the fact you're the 4th largest industry in this state. Mm-hmm. You're right up there with pharmaceuticals and all these entities, but we don't present ourselves that way. Mm-hmm. And I think more and more we do think about that side, but I think it's very important when you come to a community like Dallas.
Mm-hmm.
You have to be the largest employer probably in Dallas.
Mm-hmm.
You're certainly one of the largest employers in the county. You don't think of yourself that way, nor do most people associated with the institution. Even the boards of directors, the trustees sometimes don't recognize. When I was, I'll finish with this, Dan, and get off this topic, but Crescent's other big employer was the state prison. So they closed the state prison. It was the right decision. They moved all the employees to other prisons. They had about 50% more employees than we had. Crescent's not a big town. There were 2 pizza shops. I went to one of them, Mr. Dunny's, and Mr. Dunny was working. And I said, Mr. Dunny, what did that do to you, when they closed the prison? He said, about 40% of my business. I said, what happens, Mr. Dunny, if Mental Wish is closed? And he said, oh, I'm done. And Mr. Dunny is the same as every other of those small businesses in that town, that depended on,
But especially pizza, because college students love to eat pizza. I think that was my main food group when I was in college, at least. So, well, this has been great, Tom, and I think we talked about a lot of really important things in the college space, especially in Pennsylvania. And I just want to say that it's great to have an organization like AICUP, because it brings us together to talk about these exact kind of things you're talking about, and to help us represent some of the things that we do better and to be more efficient. One of the best things that AICUP does is that we have these business efficiency programs.
We need to do another show on that, Dan.
Yeah, but it's great, and it allows all of us to save money and to use power in our collective purchasing and so forth to save money so that we are saving money for our students in the end.
Which is one of the reasons that our net tuition is down.
That's exactly right. It's exactly right. So I would just say, on behalf of all of us in Pennsylvania and all of the independent colleges, thank you, Tom, because you do a tremendous job working with this organization, with all of us in it, to really try to do the best we can in the most efficient way possible. And it's powerful to get together and to do that stuff in that way.
Thank you, Dan. We have a great team, as you know, Dan.
Thanks for joining us today. We've been speaking with Tom Foley, president of AICUP, and we hope you enjoyed this installment of the Higher Edification Podcast, brought to you by the Association of Independent Colleges and Universities of Pennsylvania and Misericordia University.